I guess I was gonna start by saying that dozens of books like Caleb's cross my desk every week at the Times. Every book that gets written on anything astronomical gets sent to me, and most of them I don't even bother reading. But actually, I find Caleb's book really is interesting and it's worth reading. So that's the first thing I have to say. There are a lot of thoughtful stuff in it. Caleb's a thoughtful guy. So I thought I'd start by asking you to explain the title. What's the Copernicus Complex? I mean, are we sick in the head or something, or what is, what's...
Well, thank you for your introduction there, Dennis. Yeah, so the Copernicus Complex, what is that really referring to? I guess the complex in this is to do with something that we have a hang-up about. In that sense, it is a complex that we carry around with us. And it's to do with a challenge that we all have in trying to understand our place in the universe, in reality. And it's this conflict that I think we've probably had since ever of asking, on the one hand, I feel important. And as a species, we seem to have evolved to wake up in the morning and the world revolves around us. But there is evidence to the contrary. There is evidence around us that we're not necessarily important either individually or as a species. And of course, Copernicus, he wasn't the first person to suggest that the mechanics of the solar system were such that the sun was actually at the center, but he was really the person who took tools of what we would recognize as modern science and apply them to understanding the arrangement of the sun, the moon, the stars, and the planets in a way that was somewhat more elegant than before. And I don't think he realized what he was doing, but he set in motion over the following decades and centuries the growth of this idea of cosmic mediocrity, that we're not central, the Earth isn't central. Not only that, that implies that there are going to be other places like this out there in the universe.
It's gotten worse in recent decades because not only are we not the center of the universe, we're not even made out of the main things that the universe is made out of. It's mostly dark matter and dark energy. And there's an implication that it's not even the only universe. There's an ungodly number of alternate universes out there. So what?
Yeah, no, I mean it's enough to give you nightmares if you need to feel significant. This is not a good age to live in. Yeah, as Dennis says, we now live at a time where we both know that the stuff that we're made of, normal matter, protons, neutrons, electrons, and so on, is a tiny piece of the total content of the universe. It's about 4% of everything else, and that this may not be the only universe. I mean, that's a really strange and
it's a hard one to swallow. It's a
hard thing to follow. It's a hard thing to even conceive. I think a lot of us, and I know I'm the same, have a hard time even understanding what it is when what we mean when we talk about this universe. What do we mean about space and time and an origin and so on? And then just to add to that, there's, in a sense, a more parochial piece of this, which is the discovery of planets around other stars in the last 20 years.
Right, so I was going to mention that. So if I can I'll make my one little speech and then I'm done in terms of introducing my own ideas, which is, so in the last 20, everybody, I think every generation of humans thinks they live in a special time in terms of the progress of science, but in this generation really is a special time, because in the last 20 years, we've discovered two things that completely changed our views. And one is that almost every star in the galaxy, or probably in the universe, has a planet around it. So there's hundreds of billions of planets in the galaxy, and most of them are relatively small and rocky, like our own, apparently. And the other thing is that there's this dark energy that's pushing the expansion of the universe faster and faster, and if it keeps going, is ultimately going to wind up with us in the middle of black nothingness. And you wouldn't think that two things could be connected, but they may be very connected because the only explanation most people have for this dark energy, which is probably something that Einstein called the cosmological constant, the energy of the vacuum, they can't calculate it, or when they do calculate it, they get a number that's so outrageously large that they throw up their hands and say, well, maybe it's just a random number, and there's gazillions of galaxies and universes. We live in the one that's right for us. And this somehow brings back the issue of life back to the center of the table, and it's a very, very almost violently controversial topic in astrophysics and cosmology. And I don't know, maybe this has something to do with your complex, but
yeah, I think it is part of this complex that we, following Copernicus, we've taught ourselves to think in terms of cosmic mediocrity, and to think that no, there is nothing particularly special about our vantage point in the universe. And that's been a very important concept for the progress of science, because it means the laws of physics here are going to be the same as the laws of physics over there, and so what we can deduce experimentally here we can apply further afield. And so it's been a very important thing to recognize that we're not central in any way. And of course it's embedded in Einstein's equations that describe the nature of the universe on the largest scale. There is no spatial center to the expanding universe. Every place in the universe is equivalent in that sense. So when you come up against anything that smacks of, well, you know what, actually maybe you are special, maybe there is something to do with the fundamental nature of the universe and the existence of life in this universe, it makes scientists, certainly people like me, very uncomfortable. And one of the questions I think I'm trying to pose in the book is not to say that we should either discard these ideas of specialness outright or accept them wholeheartedly, but we should think about it. We should think about, well, are we being a little too sweeping in saying that there's nothing particularly special about life, but at the same time we don't want to embrace something that raises us up in a way that makes no sense.
Yeah, I think in one place you talk about sort of devising a figure of merit for universes or something, and how likely they might be to develop life, which seems like a very ambitious object.
It is an ambitious, but I think it's an interesting thing to ponder, because some of the arguments that, and I think you're sort of referring obliquely to, they're to do with what's called the anthropic principle. The idea that if you look out at the properties of the universe, and this was something that people were talking about back 30, 40 years ago, you begin to see that there are fundamental properties of the cosmos that, while unrelated to each other, are all set to certain values such that they give rise to all the things necessary for life to exist. So they give rise to stars that produce carbon, for example, and carbon is an integral piece of our biochemistry, and carbon chemistry is incredibly complex and flexible and important. Without carbon chemistry, you couldn't have the sort of complexity that arises in life. And there are other aspects to this that you can look at and you say, well, if you changed any of these things that are otherwise seemingly independent, or at least we have no deeper physics model to say what they should be, you wouldn't get life. And that, for a while, people were saying, well, that means life is somehow telling us something about the deeper functioning of the universe. Now, of course, you could say if the universe weren't this way, we wouldn't be here to make that observation. So it kind of has to be like that. But it's still a very uncomfortable situation, because, and this is before these ideas of a multiverse really came out, and they actually arose in part because of people thinking about this. If this were the once and only universe, the only thing like this that is going to happen, why on earth would it be tuned for life? Why would everything line up just right for life? And that's a really uncomfortable idea for
maybe
most
we're just
scientists.
very lucky.
Well, this is possible, and it's, you know, and this is the funny thing about these sorts of inferences based on, you know, single data points, and trying to make inferences about things where you're part of the experiment in a sense. Right? Yeah. If it weren't this way, you would not be here to make these observations. That ties us all in knots, basically. So one of the ideas that I think is interesting out of that, though, is even if the universe is somehow tuned for life, we don't know if it's tuned for more than one instance of life. And that's kind of interesting. And this comes back to the question of asking, is there life out there? Is there any other living planet in the cosmos? And not just, is there another one? How many are there? How many times has life happened in the universe? And perhaps that number is interesting. And perhaps that number, it certainly gives us some sort of quantitative thing to say about our significance, our status, because let's say there's a billion living planets in this galaxy, and the universe contains a couple of hundred, perhaps probably more like 300 or 400 billion galaxies with a similar fertility for life. That tells us something, and we can make a decision about whether that makes life rare or not, or important or not. But if we begin to discover that, you know, maybe there's one other planet in our galaxy that has life, I mean, how we do that is another question. You know, that in some sense it's a smaller number. So what do we do with that? I don't know what we do with that, but it's a very interesting thing to try to find out.
Right. How much does it have to be like us to be life? I mean, this isn't an answer you can really answer, question you can really answer, I guess, but I always wonder if we would even recognize a sufficiently different or advanced form of life.
Sure, and I think this is something that, again, we certainly as scientists have a hard time dealing with, because we're very used to thinking in our terms, in terms of the sort of chemistry that we understand about life on Earth and the ways in which that has played out over the last 4 billion years here. What we don't know, even if the biochemistry is the same, is whether if you could set the clock back to 4 billion years ago and start it going again with all the right ingredients, whatever they are, whatever they were, to set life in motion here, would it play out in any way that would be recognizable? And I think we don't have an answer to that. And it could be even more extreme, and perhaps this is what you're alluding to, that, you know, life, if you stop a scientist in a street and ask them, define life, I guarantee that you'll get a different answer every time you do that, because there is no single accepted scientific definition for what life is.
There is an official NASA definition.
Well, that must be the one then.
but it's,
if it's NASA.
Which is something like it's a chemical reaction capable of replication and evolution. But when you ask scientists about it, they, you know, which I did for a series of articles once, they says, well, I don't know, I'll recognize it when I see it.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much the answer most people get down to. People will talk about, well, there's entropy, and life, you know, creates greater entropy around itself while it lowers its own entropy. If you look at the way a cell works, or a chicken or something like that, and yes, it's got to replicate, it's got to be able to mutate so that you can have natural selection and evolution and so on, and it has to be able to extract energy from its surroundings. But those are all very broad. I mean, even the NASA definition, you know, it says chemistry.
It's extremely broad. I mean, so I know a guy who has these things like this in his lab, but he himself says they don't seem like life to him, but they fulfill this requirement. But so, and now it's someplace in there, the book, you say that that the process by which life originated, maybe it's all non-linear things working together non-linearly, and it's really a chaotic process. And I thought that was kind of interesting. Can you elucidate on that at all?
Yeah, so I mean, this, I'd like to say it was my idea. It's not really. A number of people have talked about this over the years, and it's to do with a phenomenon known as emergence. And kind of put that in a nutshell, it's not necessarily just to do with life. It can be to do with many, many things in the natural world. If you have a set of relatively simple rules that apply to, let's say, for example, and I use an example sometimes of a flock of birds flying around, and sometimes you can get huge flocks of birds, thousands, tens of thousands of birds flying around. Now, each individual bird, if you just saw the flight path of a single bird, it would be kind of boring. It's just flying around the sky doing its thing. What you can't see by watching a single bird is the interaction that it has with all the other birds in that enormous flock. And each of them is also just flying around, but they're flying around in some way that's connected to the birds around them. And what happens is stuff emerges. You see these extraordinary shapes emerge in the flock of birds flying around. Maybe you've seen this. They sweep across the landscape, and it's actually, you're seeing almost like waves of pressure and form drifting and passing through this flock of birds. And that's an emergent phenomenon. It's simple rules for sort of individual pieces of that phenomena, but when you put it all together, something new happens. Something comes out of it, something emerges. And that's a much deeper idea than just a flock of birds.
It's almost like the Borg.
The Borg?
The Borg.
The Borg. I don't know if we should get into the
That's a group mind, but it's...
Yeah, well, right. In the Borg, right? This is for those of you who don't know, right? This is science fiction. This is Star Trek, and there's a species is essentially machines, and each individual machine is built often around a organic species, a human who's been captured and converted into part machine, part human. But each individual is just like a very simple thing, a little cog in this.
It's like a group mind, right? Isn't it?
Right. And so it's a group mind. When you put them all together, they become extraordinarily powerful, because each of them is like a cell in a bigger organism. And that's another sort of example, perhaps, of emergence. And people have talked about this. How does multicellular life emerge? If we watch colonies of bacteria, they interact in ways that on a one-to-one level are very simple, but overall the colony shows extremely complex and apparently sophisticated behavior. And so in the book I talk a little bit about how that may be a better way to conceptualize something like life, and that also may be a way to understand how you can start life. Because this is still a big question that nobody really has an answer to, which is, well, how did life begin here on Earth? What were the first steps? And for a long time, people have said, well, if you take just a pond of water and you throw the building blocks of life into it, so molecules that we know play an integral part in today's biology, things like amino acids and so on, but they're still simple molecules. But you throw them in this pond and you kind of shake it, how long do you have to wait for something living to emerge? Well, if you just do the numbers, you wait forever. And this is a big problem, because the simple number of combinations and permutations that would have to somehow be explored by this pond of shaking water is colossal. And so in the past, people have actually pointed to this and said, well, that may mean that life didn't start here. So they just sort of outsource the problem and say, well, we don't understand it, so it probably came from somewhere else. Now, of course, where did that start? Well, we don't. It doesn't really solve the problem. But I think these properties of emergence that seem to be so common across every arena of the natural world, from chemistry to biology and so on, may offer an insight to how that pond of goop could much more quickly get to a place where there are molecular structures that might not be the same as the ones today in life, but that somehow set in motion the extra complexity, set in motion the possibility of natural selection, even at a chemical level. So, I don't think anyone has a very good, hard theory about this, but I think it's an interesting idea, and I think it also speaks to the possible number of trajectories that life could perhaps take, however it emerges. And there may be different ways that life can emerge. We're very fixated on finding the origin of life. Well, maybe there were a bunch of different things happening, and it's also possible that life emerged in different ways on an early Earth 4 billion years ago, and then competed. And what we are is the result of that competition.
Right. We won the lottery. Or the... so you have this really interesting idea in there about microbes, about how maybe we're just sort of drones for microbes, that the microbes are really running everything. There's how many trillions of genes or something scattered around in the ocean? Some ungodly number, only a few thousand of which we use in our own bodies. So what are the rest of them for? And are we just kind of controlled by our our microbes? And
so this is something that has been sort of getting onto everyone's radar in recent years from a number of different directions. So, for example, with human biology, we now understand that a typical human carries around 10 times more single-celled organisms than our own cells. So single-celled organisms, or microbes, I mean bacteria, or the other type of single-celled organism called archaea. So these are microscopic, they're much smaller than our cells, they're somewhat simpler. We, as an adult human, perhaps have 10 trillion of our own cells. We also carry around 10 times that many cells of things like bacteria, so 100 trillion cells, but they're smaller and less massive. So an adult human has about maybe 2 pounds worth of microbes that we lug around with us. But those microbes carry at least 100 times more genes than our genes in terms of unique genetic material that does something interesting. We can't live without it. It's become known as the human microbiome. And it's been suggested that it's even we think of it as another organ in our bodies. We can't digest our food without these microbes, and there are many different types of them. They're enormously diverse. There are tens of thousands of species that just inhabit humans. And they're intimately related with our biochemistry, our brain chemistry. They're indications that some of our behavioral characteristics are influenced by the sort of microbes that we carry around. We all carry slightly different mixtures. Some of us have more similar mixes than others. And at the same time as that's been emerging out of biology and microbiology, we're realizing that this is also true of the planet as a whole, that the dominant type of life on the Earth is microbial, single-celled organisms. They've been around since ever, or at least since 4 billion years ago. And they dominate the biomass of the planet. They engineer and re-engineer the planet and have been doing so for the past 4 billion years. The oxygen we breathe is a great example of this. It comes from plants, but how did plants learn to make oxygen? Well, they do it because originally some bacteria figured out that you could take sunlight and you could use that as part of your metabolism, and a byproduct is that you make oxygen. And
that process that nature evolved is pretty good, but not as good as it could be. That was kind of interesting.
Yeah, so this is true. Yeah, so of various metabolic processes, so these metabolism is the way in which organisms extract energy from the environment and build structure. Things like photosynthesis, which is perhaps, I think, the most complex metabolic process known. It requires has the most genetic material to code, to the design, if you will. I shouldn't use that word. Just strike that word. To code the intricate molecular structures that photosynthesis use. It's a lot of genetic code in there. But if we sit at our computer and do theoretical chemistry and ask, well, is that as efficient as it could be? It turns out it's not. And there are other metabolic processes, things to do with, for example, nitrogen fixation, where the sorts of proteins and molecular structures that life seems to have converged on, they work well, but they're not as good as they could be. And so it's kind of interesting that life seems to, once it latches onto something that works well enough, it kind of stops there.
Is it possible that the system we have is more reliable than the more efficient system?
Well, so this is, so it may be too easy to say that it's not efficient enough because there are other factors involved. It may be that it's more resilient. It may not be as efficient as it could be, but if something goes wrong, it doesn't completely fail. Right, so it's like instead of your Jaguar car that if the slightest thing goes wrong, it won't even start.
It's supposed to be much better these days.
Yeah, so they say. I'm not sure. I hope Jaguar is not watching this. Compared to your Skoda, right? Which, it just keeps going. It may sort of fall apart a little bit, but it keeps rolling down the street at least. And so it may be that the terrestrial biology kind of works a little bit like that, which is very interesting because it means that somewhere else, perhaps, you could either do better or you don't need to do as well in terms of evolving to a point where you can do something like photosynthesis or find other ways to survive.
All right, so speaking of somewhere else, so I have to ask you this because everybody will ask you, right? So what do you think? Are we alone or not? Are we going to find other life out there within our lifetimes?
That's a fair question. I think having written the book and thought about this pretty intensely during the period of writing the book, I've come to the conclusion that I'm much more optimistic than I was. In the sense I'm much more optimistic that there is other life out there that may be equally complex. Sometimes people talk about, well, there's life out there, but it's going to be bacteria or it's going to be something simple because that type of organism seems very resilient and it's easier to imagine perhaps how that evolves. I'm not sure it's easier to imagine.
But we've seen what those simple organisms did on Earth.
Well, that's the thing. So those simple organisms have created us. They've engineered and re-engineered the planet many times during the history of the Earth. Stuff happens on the Earth, an asteroid comes and hits it, kind of changes the balance of everything. It's essentially the microbial life that responds to that. And it doesn't always respond by trying to reset things. It may say, well, actually, it's obviously not thinking about this, but the nature of natural selection evolution means it comes up with a different solution to existing. So maybe the atmosphere has oxygen now, or maybe it doesn't. Maybe in the future that'll change and so on. But I think arguments that are made to suggest that more complicated life, and that includes intelligent life, whatever that means. I think there's a broad range of what intelligence is. I think an octopus is intelligent, and perhaps as intelligent as me. It's just different. I think the conclusion I came to was that the opportunity for life to be as complex as us or other large multicellular organisms may be high, except it's going to be very different every time. So in that sense, it can be complex but incredibly alien. Everything may be incredibly alien, and it may be incredibly alien to each other. So there may be no planet out there where there's other life that we're going to know what on Earth to do with, or to how to communicate or to think about, and that may be true everywhere. Now, are we going to discover these other living planets out there in the next 10, 20 years or so? There's a chance we'll have some clues. I'd like to be able to say that we'll know for sure. But I think there's the opportunity to perhaps get some clues as to whether there are planets out there that have been chemically altered by the presence of life, and this is something that astronomers are working towards. It's incredibly challenging. It requires new technology because we're looking at very small, faint objects a long way away, and we're trying to extract quite detailed information basically just by looking at the light from those objects, to say things about the chemistry of atmospheres on a planet orbiting another star and so on. I think we could be lucky. It's conceivable we'll be lucky, and there's a planet out there not too far away around another star where something big is happening, and people have even talked about looking for pollution. What's a good signature of an extraterrestrial civilization is that it's screwing up its atmosphere, or it's doing something to its environment that is not just breathing in and out, but it's running its cars, or it's got its power plants, and it's doing something kind of obscene to the environment.
That could be discouraging in some ways.
Well, it would be discouraging to know that we're not alone in that sense. But maybe it's that's how it's going to be. There is still, I think, great hope that we'll learn about whether or not life has or does exist in our own solar system beyond the Earth. So, for example, on Mars. The catch to that is, even though we can go and explore Mars, there's a rover roving around Mars as we sit here. Is that it's possible what we'll find in a place like Mars, if life has ever existed there or still exists in some form, presumably microbial at this stage. It's interesting, back in the early 1960s, you can see records of where people like Carl Sagan, before the first flyby of Mars by spacecraft, was enthusing about the possibility of vegetation, what might we see. And then, of course, the first spacecraft, Mariner 4, zips by Mars, takes a bunch of pictures, and everyone realizes it's dry and dusty and there's not much there. To come back to, so if we find something on Mars, there's a great possibility that it's related to us.
Or we're related to it.
Or we're related to it. And this is a very interesting idea that 4 billion years ago, the conditions on Mars and the conditions on Earth were obviously different. The temperatures were different, the configuration of, certainly on the Earth, the oceans and continents would have been very different, and the chemistry was different. It is conceivable that Mars was a better place for life to have originated in the solar system, and then it got transferred to the Earth, perhaps on the back of a meteorite. So when an asteroid hits a planet, it can chip off pieces, and those pieces can travel through interplanetary space and end up back on the other planet. So there's a possibility either we're Martians or the Martians are Earthlings, or some mix, and that would be fascinating. The thing about it, though, is it wouldn't actually help us in this quest to understand the frequency with which life occurs in the universe. It would simply say that in this case, it's popped up and it managed to inhabit a couple of planets before time passed and things changed.
Although it would imply that it only popped up once.
Well, yeah. So maybe, yeah. I mean, that would be an interesting, So the interesting thing would be how, suppose you find an organism on Mars, and you get it into a lab and you look at it and it's got DNA, except lots of things are different enough that you have a hard time saying whether or not it diverged from a common ancestor or whether it's a truly independent strain of life. That would be, it would be a fascinating scientific problem, but it would be a challenge.
One we'd love to follow and report about. Now you also mentioned something called the Great Filter.
So I sort of planted this idea to talk, because it's sort of interesting and it often comes up. There's this notion, and it mixes together a bunch of things. I'll describe it very quickly. There was a famous question posed by a physicist called Enrico Fermi, or at least the story goes that he kind of posed this question. It's a little more complicated than that. But the basic question is, if life is not incredibly rare in our galaxy, if life that is intelligent and technological is not incredibly rare, then over the last 10 billion years or so, the period of time that our galaxy, the Milky Way, has existed with its stars and planets, if life has happened somewhere else and it's technological and it's figured out how to travel between the stars, even if it does it kind of slowly, it should be everywhere by now. And so this was a puzzle, because unless something was stopping that, we really should be in the sort of Star Trek universe or the Star Wars universe, that there should be organisms buzzing around in spacecraft and doing stuff all around us. And we don't seem to have seen that, or at least we don't think we've seen that. Maybe if you live in a trailer in Nevada, you've seen that a few times. But we don't think we've seen that. And so what are the solutions? Well, one solution is that, well, actually life is very rare. We're really the only example of any sort of complex technological life in this galaxy. The other possibility is a little scary, and it's sometimes couched in terms of this great filter. And so the idea is, well, there's something that stops life getting too advanced. There's something that stops technological life from going interstellar, that prevents an interstellar civilization. And it could be all sorts of things. It could be, that perhaps, at a certain level of sophistication, a technological life form, it can't cope. It doesn't deal well with the situation. It uses up all its natural resources before it gets to go interstellar and so on. Or maybe there's something else. Maybe there's something in the history of life that prevents that. Now, where this becomes scary is when people talk about the implications for us, because the thing is, we don't know. Assuming you believe that we really have looked hard enough to eliminate the possibility of an interstellar civilization out there. The question is, which side of the great filter are we on? Are we before or are we after? Now, if we're after it, we're going to be that interstellar civilization. We've passed through. We've somehow made it through. And we're the ones. We're the ones who are going to eventually populate the galaxy. If we're on the wrong side of the great filter, that's a problem. And in fact, some people have gone so far, and you may like this, with the recent discovery of so many exoplanets, including some of which maybe, perhaps, possibly could be somewhat like the Earth. So planets about the size of the Earth orbiting their star at a distance where, perhaps there could be liquid water and chemistry that's familiar and so on. Let's suppose in the future we're able to go and peer at those planets, well, not to go, but to use our telescopes to peer at those planets. We start to see that there are indeed technological civilizations. Now, according to people who like the idea of the great filter, that would be really bad news, because if civilizations get to a certain point and then self-destruct, then we're seeing our future. If these planets are of a similar technological level to us, it means none of us have yet gone through the great filter. And that means we're all probably about to go through the great filter and be taken off the charts. So it's kind of, so it's a fun thing. But I will say this, and I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but when people say, we know there aren't interstellar civilizations out there, I kind of think, well, actually, I don't think we do know. And I'm not suggesting that stuff is actually buzzing around in our solar system today, but I think we have a history of grossly overestimating our ability to monitor what's going on in the universe around us, and we have a history of grossly overestimating that we've eliminated all possibilities. The truth of it is that whether you're looking for radio signals or whether you're trying to peer at the chemistry of distant planets, we're still essentially blind. And it's because the cosmos is big, things are far away, faint, hard to detect. Our telescopes are not that great. We have a hard time even charting out the asteroids in our own solar system. So that's why people will get panicky, because we don't know if there's some big asteroid out there that in 20, 30 years its orbit is going to cross the Earth's orbit, and that's the end of civilization as we know it. So I think there's room for maneuver there. It's conceivable that there isn't a great filter. Maybe there aren't so many technological civilizations. Maybe they don't travel so far out into interstellar space, but they could be out there.
Right. My two things I think about is, one filter is the Interstellar Budget Organization, which
sort of federal
want to spend the money. And then, but my favorite is something called the zoo hypothesis, which says that basically they put us off limits because we're kind of this primitive, interesting species, and they don't want to disturb us, like some Stone Age tribe in Brazil or something like that.
Right. Yeah. No. I mean, that's a lovely idea. And the interesting thing about this question of where is everyone, that there are so many potential solutions to that you can think of. The zoo hypothesis, or maybe they're here and we just don't know it.
Well, if somebody dropped an iPhone on the moon, we wouldn't have found it yet.
Well, that's true. Yeah. So actually, that's a very good point. Our ability to look for artifacts of extraterrestrial intelligence is also very limited. And yeah, we've landed in how many places on the moon and walked around? Like 6.
A few.
We're running a little short on time. So I just wanted to see if there were any questions out here for Caleb and Alice.
It's an intimate audience tonight.
Yeah.
Go ahead, ask anything.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your research and what you're focused on in your day job. I mean, what are the things that you're most kind of looking into?
Sure. This will put everyone to sleep. So right now, one of my research interests and focuses is actually on this question of what do living planets look like, and in particular to take the tools that we've used for now several decades to understand things about, for example, the climate of the Earth, the way in which it responds to changes in season, the way in which it responds to changes in the biology of the planet, and to apply those tools to questions of alternative Earths, planets that are not like the Earth, but similar enough that perhaps there would be life there. I'm also very interested in understanding the nature of planetary orbits, which sounds kind of old-fashioned and boring, but it turns out that now that we've seen many thousands, in fact now, of exoplanetary systems, we realize that our understanding of how planetary orbits come to be the way they are is pretty poor, because our solar system is not like a lot of other solar systems, and there seems to be extraordinary diversity in the orbital patterns that we see in exoplanetary systems, and also in the pathways to forming certain types of planets. And so one of the things that I'm interested in and I work on is actually taking state-of-the-art computer simulations of gravity, of the sort of stuff that Newton was doing 600 years ago, well, 400 years ago, with pen and paper, and bringing it up to speed using sophisticated computer algorithms to actually model tens of thousands of virtual planetary systems in order to sift through that to begin to understand both things about the history of our own solar system in terms of planetary orbits, because our planetary orbits are not actually fixed in stone. They actually change over time, and they may change in the future as well. And also to apply this to questions of what's going on in these new solar systems, these exoplanetary systems, to try to pin down the characteristics of planets that could conceivably be the places we want to look for life on. Because it's going to be a really tough job, and you're going to have to pick planets out there that you want to focus on, both literally and figuratively.
Anyone else?
Maybe it's a rude question, but what is the novelty of your book? Because I've heard all this stuff before that you talked about. Everything.
Everything? Well, I think, I think what I try to do in my book that I think is different is I wrote the book without a preconceived notion of what the answer would be. I tried to synthesize a vast amount of science that isn't usually synthesized into addressing this question. People often either talk about planets, or they talk about biology, or they talk about probabilities, or they talk about things to do with cosmology. I haven't seen too many people try to pull all of that together to take a good hard look at the very cutting edge science, but to also ask questions about what is it that we might be missing? What are our biases? And this really comes back to Dennis's first question about the Copernicus Complex, because in science too, we have to be extraordinarily careful about blinkering ourselves from the truth, because we know the answer, or because we think things are this way. And so I hope in the book that I take a slightly different angle on this than, to my understanding, people have done before in writing about this stuff. The problem is, and perhaps this is what's making you feel uncomfortable, is we don't have an answer yet, right? So it's true, I've written a book for something which we do not yet have the answer, but I think we're getting extraordinarily close, and I think we do have the opportunity already to begin to see where this might be headed. And that's what I try to focus on in the book, because there is this conundrum, and again, sort of alluded to this earlier on, that on the one hand, there's all this evidence that says we're cosmically mediocre. There can't be anything special about either us, life on Earth, the solar system, or whatever. And that's evidence that comes in many forms, everything from chemistry to the abundance of planets. On the other hand, there's all this evidence that says, well, you know what? Maybe there is something special here. And people either tend to write about the first or the second. I'm not sure if anyone writes about both of those things. And so what I've tried to do is say, well, how do we resolve this conundrum? It's a real conundrum. It's something you can't just shove under the carpet, and you can't take one side or the other. There is evidence for and there is evidence against our status, cosmic status, specialness, or other. And I try to see what the resolution to that will be, and that's part of, I think, my response to one of Dennis's questions, which is I think we may be unique but not exceptional, and by that I mean that the only logical way I can see to resolve this is to say that life of a similar complexity with a similarly complex history has probably happened in many, many different places. It's all going to be different though. So you can kind of have your cake and eat it at the same time. So absolutely right, yeah. Can I say anything brand new? We don't know if there's life anywhere else in the universe. So that question has not yet been answered, but I'm trying to show where I think it's headed.
So what do you think, for example, about this type, creative and approach and the good written skills, etc. So what makes you more creative and novel than that?
Well, it's much better written.
I think we have one last question in the back.
Who's leading the way in the research in this area? Is it private? Is it university? Is it government?
It's a good question. We were actually talking about this before we started. Well, I guess it's right now it is still federally, certainly in the US, and I guess in Europe too, it's still the state-funded science. So it's here in the US, it's the NSF, it's NASA. That's where the majority, the money comes from, and that's that's supporting the majority of the cutting edge research here. There is growing interest in seeing whether some of this could be accomplished with private money, because federal funding is difficult these days. There's not as much money as there used to be. The problems we're trying to tackle are much more difficult than many have been in the past. I don't think that shift to private money has fully happened yet. There are certain foundations that are funding a lot of this work. For example, up at Harvard, there's an Origins Institute that is funded primarily through donation, through private money, and they're doing terrific work. They're doing cutting-edge work. There are schemes out there, I won't name anything explicitly, for space-based telescopic missions to look for life on other planets that circumvent all government funding, because the scientists have gotten frustrated. They feel that it's within reach, but it's going to take too long and it's going to be too difficult to do it through government funding. So they're reaching out to private industry, to individuals who have deep pockets, and saying, look, this is a really incredible question that we are on the verge of answering, we think. Wouldn't that be a great thing to invest in? So, so right now it may be in a period of transition.
It's also worth noting that a lot of private money is going into giant ground-based telescopes that will be coming online in the next 10 years and will be powerful enough to make some progress in this field. So it's a kind of mixture across the board.
I think that's about all we have time for tonight. Thanks for you guys for coming out, and thanks so much to Caleb and Dennis. And they'll be signing at the table
Thanks for
behind
having us.
Thank you.